Across frozen coasts, dense forests, and silent rivers, moments of calm can shatter in seconds when the wild turns on those who enter its domain. Camps scatter, and silence erupts into chaos. From an Alaskan RV park in 2019 to a polar night in 2022, the encounters grow more harrowing. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters that remain unforgettable. The remote wilderness of southern Alaska had always attracted adventurers seeking untouched beauty and solitude, far from the congested tourist routes that dominated the coastal regions. In July 2019, a small RV park nestled between dense spruce forests and rolling hills became the site of one of the most horrifying bear encounters in recent Alaskan history. The area, located roughly 40 miles from the nearest town, had been a seasonal camping spot for decades, drawing photographers, fishermen, and nature enthusiasts who valued its isolation. The park consisted of approximately 20 RV spaces, a small communal area with picnic tables and basic facilities. Cell phone reception was non-existent, and the nearest ranger station required a 2-hour drive along unpaved logging roads. Cassidy Thornwell, a 23-year-old photographer from Oregon, had arrived at the park 3 days earlier, with plans to capture the midnight sun illuminating Alaska's dramatic landscapes. She traveled alone in a compact camper van, spending her days hiking nearby trails and her evenings editing photos on her laptop. Cassidy had researched bear safety protocols before her trip, carrying bear spray and making noise while walking. Still, like many visitors, she underestimated how quickly situations could deteriorate when wild animals were involved. The evening of July 18th began peacefully enough. The midnight sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that photographers dreamed about. Families grilled salmon and hot dogs outside their RVs while children chased each other between trailers, their laughter echoing through the quiet forest. Several campers had gathered around a fire pit near the communal area, sharing stories about their Alaskan adventures. The temperature hovered around 60 degrees, comfortable enough for light jackets, but not cold enough to drive anyone indoors. Cassidy emerged from her van around 9:30 in the evening, camera in hand, hoping to photograph the alpenglow striking the distant mountains. She walked roughly 30 feet from her vehicle to get a better angle, positioning herself near the edge of the clearing where the forest met the campground. Other campers noticed her but paid little attention, as they were accustomed to seeing fellow visitors wandering about with cameras and binoculars. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. A massive coastal grizzly bear, later estimated to weigh over 800 pounds, suddenly burst from the tree line approximately 15 yards from where Cassidy stood. The animal moved with shocking velocity for something so large, its powerful legs propelling it across the ground in seconds. Several witnesses reported hearing the thunderous sound of breaking branches moments before the bear appeared. However, the noise had not registered as unusual in an area where wildlife constantly moved through the forest. Cassidy froze completely, her camera still raised to her eye. Freezing was the worst possible response, as experts later noted, though the instinctive paralysis that grips many people during sudden predator encounters is well documented and difficult to overcome. The bear closed the distance in mere seconds, rising briefly on its hind legs before crashing down onto Cassidy with devastating force. She collapsed under the animal's weight, her camera tumbling several feet away onto the gravel. The campground erupted into chaos. Parents screamed for their children to get inside the RVs immediately. Several men grabbed whatever makeshift weapons they could find, including metal tent poles, large pots, and air horns. Marcus Keller, a retired firefighter camping with his wife, sprayed an entire canister of bear deterrent in the direction of the attack, but the wind carried most of it away from the bear. Another camper, whose name was never publicly released, attempted to drive his pickup truck toward the scene while repeatedly honking the horn, hoping the noise would scare the animal away. Nothing worked. The bear dragged Cassidy toward the dense spruce forest, moving with purposeful determination despite the commotion erupting around it. Witnesses described the scene as surreal and nightmarish, watching helplessly as the young woman disappeared into the trees. The entire attack, from the moment the bear emerged until it vanished back into the forest, lasted less than 90 seconds. Several campers immediately attempted to follow, but the thick underbrush and failing light made pursuit dangerous and nearly impossible. Marcus Keller managed to locate Cassidy's camera near where the attack began. When he examined it later, he discovered the final photograph showed two small cubs, roughly 20 yards behind where the mother bear had emerged, completely unaware of the violent encounter unfolding ahead of them. Wildlife experts who reviewed the image later concluded that Cassidy had unknowingly positioned herself between a protective mother grizzly and her offspring, triggering one of the most dangerous scenarios possible in bear country. The park manager radioed for emergency assistance, but the remote location meant help would take considerable time to arrive. Alaska State Troopers and wildlife officers reached the scene approximately 3 hours later, equipped with high-powered rifles and tracking equipment. They recovered Cassidy's body the following morning, roughly half a mile from the campground. The medical examiner later determined she had died within minutes of the initial attack. Wildlife officials tracked and eventually located the female grizzly and her two cubs several miles from the RV park. After a lengthy debate among experts and officials, authorities decided against destroying the bear, determining she had acted purely on maternal instinct rather than predatory aggression. The cubs, estimated to be roughly 8 months old, depended entirely on their mother for survival, and destroying her would have condemned them to starvation. The tragedy forced the RV park to implement stricter safety protocols, including mandatory bear safety orientations for all visitors and restrictions on evening activities outside vehicles. The incident reinforced what wildlife experts had warned for years. Alaska's wilderness demanded constant vigilance and respect. Even experienced outdoor enthusiasts could find themselves in lethal situations within seconds when wild animals felt threatened. Kodiak Island, located in the Gulf of Alaska, had long been recognized as one of the most pristine and dangerous wilderness areas in North America. The island stretched across roughly 3,600 square miles of rugged terrain, characterized by dense forests, volcanic peaks, and countless hidden coves accessible only by seaplane or boat. In September 2024, this remote landscape became the setting for a harrowing encounter that would reinforce warnings about the unpredictable nature of Kodiak bears, the largest brown bears on Earth. Nora Sullivan, a 29-year-old aviator and wildlife photographer from Washington State, flew her single-engine seaplane to Kodiak Island to document puffins and sea otters during their autumn migration patterns. Nora had earned her pilot's license 5 years earlier and had since logged hundreds of hours flying across Alaska's coastal regions. She prided herself on thorough preparation, always checking weather reports, filing flight plans, and carrying emergency supplies. However, like many experienced outdoors people, she had grown perhaps too comfortable operating in bear country. The morning of September 12th brought ideal conditions for photography. Clear skies, calm waters, and temperatures hovering around 50 degrees created perfect circumstances for capturing wildlife. Nora landed her seaplane in a secluded cove on the island's northeastern shore, an area she had scouted during previous flights, but never actually visited on foot. The cove, surrounded by towering spruce trees and rocky outcroppings, appeared deserted and peaceful. She secured the aircraft to a natural rock formation using nylon rope, grabbed her camera equipment and a small backpack containing lunch, and began walking inland along a game trail. For roughly 40 minutes, Nora moved through the forest, photographing birds and occasionally stopping to observe sea otters playing in nearby tidal pools. The forest floor was thick with moss and fallen leaves, muffling her footsteps completely. She had traveled approximately 300 yards from her seaplane when she decided to head back, satisfied with the morning's work. As Nora emerged from the tree line back toward the cove, she immediately noticed something wrong. A massive Kodiak bear, standing at least 9 feet tall when upright, was investigating her seaplane with obvious curiosity. The animal sniffed at the pontoons, pawed at the fuselage, and appeared particularly interested in the passenger compartment where Nora had left her fuel containers and additional food supplies. She estimated the bear weighed at least 1,200 pounds, its brown fur rippling over powerful muscles as it moved. Nora froze approximately 50 yards away, her heart hammering in her chest. She had read countless articles about bear encounters and knew that running would trigger chase instincts. Instead, she remained perfectly still. hoping the animal would lose interest and wander back into the forest. For several agonizing minutes, the bear continued its investigation, occasionally glancing in her direction but showing no aggressive behavior. Finally, it dropped to all fours and ambled back toward the tree line, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. Nora waited another 5 minutes before cautiously approaching her aircraft. She needed to inspect for damage and retrieve essential items before departing. As she drew closer, she noticed scratches along the plane's aluminum skin. She discovered that the bear had managed to tear open a storage compartment, scattering maps and emergency supplies across the rocks. She began gathering the scattered items, constantly scanning the tree line for movement. Without warning, the Kodiak bear reappeared from behind a cluster of boulders, moving far more quickly than before. Nora barely had time to register the animal's presence before it covered the distance between them. The bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over her, and swung one massive paw in a sweeping arc. The blow connected with Nora's left shoulder and upper arm, the force spinning her completely around and sending her sprawling across the rocky beach. Pain exploded through her body as claws tore through her jacket and shirt, leaving deep lacerations along her shoulder blade and bicep. Nora scrambled desperately toward the seaplane, using the aircraft as a barrier between herself and the bear. She began shouting at the top of her lungs, waving her uninjured arm frantically and making herself appear as large and threatening as possible. The bear dropped to all fours, circled the plane twice while huffing loudly, then suddenly retreated into the forest. Wildlife experts later theorized that the bear had been startled by Nora's sudden vocalizations and aggressive posturing, combined with the unfamiliar metallic smell and appearance of the aircraft. Despite significant blood loss and searing pain, Nora managed to start the seaplane's engine and execute an emergency takeoff. She flew directly to the nearest coastal town, where emergency medical personnel treated her wounds. The injuries required 47 stitches and months of physical therapy, but she survived without permanent disability. Wildlife authorities who reviewed the incident emphasized that Kodiak bears possessed intense curiosity about unusual objects and smells, particularly anything associated with food or fuel. They warned that these animals could shift from apparently calm investigation to aggressive behavior within seconds, especially if they felt cornered or surprised. The case reinforced crucial lessons about maintaining constant awareness in bear country and never assuming that an animal's retreat signaled permanent departure from an area. The remote wilderness rivers of northwestern Montana had attracted serious anglers for generations, offering pristine waters where cutthroat and rainbow trout thrived in abundance. These waterways wound through dense forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, creating isolated corridors where human presence remained minimal, even during peak fishing season. In June 2018, one such river became the site of a tragic encounter that would demonstrate how quickly peaceful outdoor recreation could transform into a deadly catastrophe when wild animals and humans unexpectedly collided. Ethan Marshall, a 35-year-old contractor from Billings, had planned the fishing trip for months as a special father-son adventure with his 10-year-old son Logan. Ethan had fished Montana's rivers since childhood and considered himself highly experienced in wilderness navigation and safety. He had purchased a new inflatable raft specifically for the expedition, a 12-foot model designed for accessing hard-to-reach fishing spots along remote tributaries. Logan, an enthusiastic young angler who had accompanied his father on numerous day trips, looked forward to camping overnight and fishing before sunrise when trout fed most actively. The pair launched their raft around 4:30 in the morning on June 14th, from a primitive access point roughly 15 miles from the nearest paved road. Dawn had not yet broken, and thick fog hung low over the water, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet in any direction. The temperature hovered around 45 degrees, cold enough that both father and son wore insulated jackets and waterproof waders. They paddled slowly downstream, occasionally using flashlights to navigate around submerged rocks and fallen trees that created hazards in the current. After traveling approximately 2 miles, Ethan identified a promising fishing hole where the river widened and deepened near a sharp bend. Dense brush and willow thickets lined both banks, creating what appeared to be excellent habitat for holding trout. He anchored the raft using a rope tied to a sturdy root system protruding from the muddy bank. The location seemed perfect, isolated and peaceful, with only the sound of moving water and occasional bird calls breaking the pre-dawn silence. Neither Ethan nor Logan realized that a large black bear, estimated later to weigh roughly 400 pounds, had been feeding along the riverbank throughout the night. The animal had caught and consumed several salmon that had become trapped in shallow pools during recent low water conditions. Black bears, though generally less aggressive than grizzlies, could become extremely territorial and dangerous when surprised near food sources, particularly in confined spaces where escape routes seemed limited. Ethan stood in the raft, working his fly rod through a series of casts, while Logan sat near the stern, watching his father's technique and occasionally checking his own spinning rod. The fog continued to muffle sound, creating an eerie isolation that made conversation feel intrusive. Approximately 20 minutes into their fishing, Ethan heard a distinct crack of breaking branches along the nearby bank. He turned his head, squinting through the fog, and felt his blood run cold. The black bear stood barely 10 feet away at the water's edge, its dark form materializing from the mist like something from a nightmare. Before Ethan could react, issue a warning, or reach for the bear spray secured in his tackle bag, the animal charged. Black bears could sprint at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour over short distances, and the confined space between the raft and the bank offered virtually no reaction time. The bear crashed through the shallow water and lunged at Ethan, its momentum and weight causing the inflatable raft to tip violently to one side. Ethan fell backward over the gunwale, splashing into the frigid water near the muddy bank. Logan screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that echoed across the water. The bear seized Ethan's leg in its jaws and dragged him partially onto the bank, shaking its head violently. Ethan fought desperately, attempting to punch and kick the animal, but the bear's strength completely overwhelmed his efforts. The attack continued with horrifying intensity as the bear bit repeatedly at Ethan's torso and arms, inflicting catastrophic injuries. Logan, paralyzed with fear for several crucial seconds, suddenly grabbed rocks from the riverbed and began throwing them at the bear while screaming continuously. The stones bounced harmlessly off the animal's thick fur, having no discernible effect. Recognizing the futility of his efforts, Logan made a decision that likely saved his own life. He abandoned the raft and ran along the riverbank, stumbling through brush and over rocks, waving his arms frantically at the river. Roughly 400 yards downstream, 2 other anglers had launched their drift boat and were beginning their morning fishing. They heard Logan's screams and spotted the boy running along the bank. Understanding immediately that something terrible had occurred, they beached their boat, and one man, whose name was never publicly released, produced a satellite phone and contacted emergency services. At the same time, the other rushed toward the attack site with Logan. By the time they reached Ethan's location, the bear had retreated into the dense forest. Ethan lay motionless on the muddy bank, his injuries clearly fatal. The responding angler, who had military medical training, checked for vital signs but found none. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks officers arrived by helicopter approximately 90 minutes later, accompanied by paramedics who officially pronounced Ethan dead at the scene. Wildlife officials tracked the bear using dogs and eventually located the animal roughly 2 miles from the attack site. They destroyed it, determining that the combination of protective food aggression and the confined riverbank environment had triggered the deadly assault. Authorities recovered remains of several partially consumed salmon near where the attack occurred, confirming that Ethan and Logan had unknowingly positioned themselves directly in the bear's active feeding territory during prime foraging hours. The tragedy devastated Logan and the Marshall family. Wildlife experts emphasized that black bears, though typically less aggressive than other bear species, could be extraordinarily dangerous when surprised near food in confined spaces. They urged anglers fishing in remote areas to make noise constantly, travel in larger groups when possible, and maintain extreme vigilance during dawn and dusk hours when bears feed most actively. The Siberian wilderness of eastern Russia had remained largely unchanged for centuries, a vast expanse of taiga forests, tundra, and isolated villages where modern conveniences arrived slowly, if at all. In the Kamchatka Peninsula region, where temperatures routinely plunged below zero during winter months, a small community dedicated to wildlife rehabilitation operated on the fringes of society. These facilities, often underfunded and minimally regulated, provided a sanctuary for orphaned or injured animals that would otherwise perish in the harsh environment. In March 2024, one such facility became the setting for a sobering reminder that wild animals, regardless of their upbringing, retained instincts that could never be fully suppressed. Ivan Petrov, a 42-year-old wildlife handler and rehabilitation specialist, had devoted nearly 2 decades to working with bears rescued from various circumstances throughout Siberia. His facility, located approximately 60 miles from the nearest town, housed several brown bears in large outdoor enclosures designed to simulate a natural habitat while protecting them from poachers and harsh weather. Ivan had gained modest recognition among regional wildlife organizations for his unconventional methods, which emphasized close personal interaction with the animals rather than maintaining strict boundaries typically recommended by international wildlife management standards. Misha, a male brown bear weighing approximately 900 pounds, had arrived at Ivan's facility 7 years earlier as a tiny cub, barely 3 months old. Hunters had killed the cub's mother for her pelt, leaving Misha alone and starving in a den during late winter. Ivan had bottle-fed the cub, slept beside him during cold nights, and gradually integrated him into the facility's bear population. Unlike other handlers who maintained professional distance, Ivan treated Misha almost like a companion. He regularly entered his enclosure without protective equipment, was fed by hand, and even incorporated the bear into educational demonstrations for visiting school groups and wildlife enthusiasts. The morning of March 8th began like countless others at the rehabilitation center. Temperatures hovered around -15 degrees Celsius, and fresh snow from the previous night covered the ground in a pristine white blanket. Ivan rose before dawn to begin morning feeding routines, preparing buckets of fish, vegetables, and supplemental nutrients for the facility's residents. His wife, Elena, who served as his assistant and managed the facility's minimal administrative duties, prepared hot tea in their small cabin adjacent to the enclosures. Ivan entered Misha's habitat around 6:30, carrying a bucket of thawed salmon and speaking in the soft, reassuring tone he always used with the bears. Misha had been sleeping in a sheltered den area. Still, he emerged at the sound of Ivan's voice, moving with the characteristic lumbering gait that belied the species' capacity for explosive speed. The bear approached Ivan calmly, showing none of the agitation or stress signals that experienced handlers learned to recognize. What neither Ivan nor Elena realized was that maintenance workers had arrived early that morning to repair a malfunctioning water pump located roughly 30 yards from Misha's enclosure. When they started the backup generator to power their tools, the machine suddenly roared, shattering the morning silence. The unexpected noise, combined with the unfamiliar vibration it created, startled Misha considerably, despite his years of habituation to various human activities and sounds. Brown bears, even those raised in captivity, possessed acute hearing and remained highly sensitive to sudden changes in their environment. The generator's roar triggered something primal in Misha's brain, activating defensive instincts that overrode years of conditioning and comfortable familiarity with Ivan. In a fraction of a second, the bear's demeanor transformed completely. His ears flattened against his skull, his lips pulled back to expose massive canines, and his entire body tensed with aggressive energy. Ivan barely had time to register the change before Misha struck. The bear's massive paw, equipped with claws roughly 3 inches long, swung in a devastating arc that connected with Ivan's chest and shoulder. The force launched Ivan backward through the air, his body crashing into the chain-link fence that formed one wall of the enclosure. He collapsed in a heap, pain exploding through his ribs and shoulder as Misha advanced, huffing loudly and displaying clear signs of agitation. Elena, who had been watching from the cabin window while drinking her tea, dropped the mug and sprinted toward the enclosure. She grabbed a high-pressure water hose, which was kept near the gate for cleaning purposes, and turned it on full blast, directing the stream at Misha's face while repeatedly screaming his name. The combination of cold water and Elena's familiar voice seemed to penetrate the bear's aggressive state. Misha hesitated, shaking his head violently to clear water from his eyes and nose, then slowly backed away from Ivan's crumpled form. Elena maintained the water spray while edging along the fence line toward the gate, never taking her eyes off Misha. The bear continued retreating, eventually withdrawing to the far corner of the enclosure where he sat on his haunches, watching the scene with what appeared to be confusion rather than continued aggression. Elena managed to unlock the gate, drag Ivan outside, and secure the enclosure before Misha could approach again. Ivan had sustained 3 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, deep lacerations across his shoulder and upper chest, and significant bruising throughout his torso. Elena drove him to the nearest hospital, a harrowing 2-hour journey over poorly maintained roads, while Ivan drifted in and out of consciousness. Surgeons repaired the damaged tissue and set his broken bones, but recovery required months of painful rehabilitation. Wildlife experts who reviewed the incident emphasized that Ivan had violated fundamental safety protocols by entering the enclosure alone and without protective equipment. They noted that even bears raised from infancy retained wild instincts that could resurface unpredictably, particularly when environmental stressors created fight-or-flight responses. The generator's sudden noise had transformed Misha momentarily from a familiar companion into a threatened wild animal reacting on pure instinct. Ivan eventually returned to work at the facility, but implemented stricter safety measures, including never entering enclosures alone and maintaining greater physical distance from the bears. The incident served as a stark reminder that years of positive interaction could never eliminate the inherent danger of working with large predators, regardless of their history or apparent docility. The glacially fed lakes of south-central Alaska represented some of the most breathtaking and isolated wilderness areas remaining in North America. In August 2025, one such lake became the setting for a terrifying encounter that demonstrated how quickly peaceful recreation could transform into a life-threatening crisis when proper precautions were ignored. Emma Rivera, a 28-year-old environmental consultant from California, had planned her solo kayaking expedition for over a year. She had accumulated considerable experience paddling coastal waters and sheltered bays, but this marked her first extended trip into Alaska's backcountry. Emma had researched the area extensively, studying maps and reading accounts from previous visitors, though her understanding of bear behavior remained largely theoretical rather than practical. She launched her 14-foot kayak from a primitive access point on August 16th, carrying camping gear, fishing equipment, and enough food for 5 days of exploration. The lake stretched approximately 8 miles long and varied in width from half a mile to nearly 2 miles at its widest point. Dense spruce forests surrounded the water on 3 sides, while the fourth opened toward a dramatic glacier that calved occasionally with thunderous roars that echoed across the valley. The water maintained a constant temperature of around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold enough to induce hypothermia within minutes if someone capsizes without proper protection. Emma wore a dry suit and carried emergency supplies, but she had grown somewhat complacent after 3 days of peaceful paddling, without encountering any wildlife larger than eagles and otters. The morning of August 19th brought ideal conditions for kayaking. The lake's surface reflected the surrounding mountains like polished glass, and temperatures had climbed to a comfortable 65 degrees. Emma paddled leisurely along the western shore, occasionally pausing to photograph particularly striking vistas or observe wildlife. Around mid-morning, she spotted a rocky beach that appeared perfect for a brief rest stop. The beach, roughly 50 feet wide and backed by towering spruce trees, offered an easy landing and enough space to stretch her legs after hours in the kayak. Emma pulled her kayak partially onto the rocks and secured it loosely with a rope tied to a piece of driftwood. She removed her backpack, which contained her lunch, energy bars, fishing bait, and various personal items, and placed it on a flat boulder approximately 15 feet from the water's edge. Her bear spray remained clipped to the kayak's deck rigging, effectively out of reach. Emma walked along the beach, working out the stiffness in her legs and taking photographs of the glacier visible in the distance. She had moved perhaps 40 yards from her kayak when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A massive coastal grizzly bear, likely weighing over 700 pounds, emerged from the forest with surprising stealth for an animal of such size. The bear's nose worked constantly, sampling the air for scents that had attracted it to this location. Emma's lunch, particularly the smoked salmon sandwiches and energy bars containing nuts and dried fruit, had created an olfactory trail that proved irresistible to the foraging predator. Emma's first instinct was to freeze completely, which proved both appropriate and inadequate given the circumstances. The bear approached her backpack directly, sniffing it thoroughly before grasping the straps in its jaws. It began dragging the pack toward the forest, moving with purposeful determination. Emma's kayak, still partially beached, blocked the most direct route to the trees. The bear attempted to maneuver around the boat, growing frustrated when the backpack straps caught on the kayak's rudder assembly. At that moment, Emma made a critical error in judgment driven by panic rather than rational thought. She began running toward her kayak, desperate to retrieve her bear spray and prevent the animal from accessing her food supplies. The sudden movement immediately attracted the grizzly's attention. Bears possessed remarkably keen eyesight for detecting motion, and Emma's sprint triggered predatory instincts that her stillness had previously kept dormant. The grizzly dropped the backpack and charged directly at Emma, covering the distance between them with shocking speed. Emma barely managed to change direction, scrambling toward a large boulder that protruded roughly 6 feet above the beach. She grabbed at the rock's rough surface, finding handholds and pulling herself upward with adrenaline-fueled strength she had not known she possessed. The bear reached the boulder seconds behind her, rising on its hind legs and swiping with one massive paw. The claws raked across Emma's lower calf and boot heel, tearing through fabric and superficially lacerating the skin, but missing any major blood vessels or tendons. Emma hauled herself onto the boulder's relatively flat top and crouched there, making herself as small as possible while gripping her paddle, which she had somehow managed to keep hold of during the frantic scramble. She began yelling at the bear, waving the paddle and attempting to appear threatening despite her terror. The grizzly circled the boulder several times, huffing and occasionally standing upright to investigate this strange human perched above it. The bear's behavior suggested curiosity and frustration, rather than pure predatory aggression, though the distinction meant little to Emma in that moment. The standoff continued for approximately 10 minutes, though Emma later described the experience as feeling like hours. During this time, she heard voices and saw movement along the shoreline roughly 200 yards distant. A group of 3 kayakers, camping at a site further up the lake, had heard Emma's screams and paddled toward the commotion. They approached cautiously, calling out to Emma and making considerable noise to alert the bear to their presence. The arrival of multiple humans finally convinced the grizzly to abandon its investigation. The bear dropped to all fours, cast a final glance toward Emma's perch, then ambled back into the forest with surprising nonchalance. The other kayakers waited several minutes to ensure the animal had truly departed before approaching Emma's position. They helped her down from the boulder and examined her injuries, which included the claw lacerations on her calf, multiple scrapes and bruises from climbing the rock, and symptoms of shock, including trembling and rapid breathing. The group radioed for emergency assistance using a satellite communicator, and Alaska State troopers arrived by float plane roughly 3 hours later. Emma received medical treatment for her wounds and spent 2 days under observation at a regional hospital before being released. Wildlife officials later returned to the beach and discovered that the grizzly had thoroughly shredded Emma's backpack and scattered its contents across a wide area. They found food wrappers, torn clothing, and equipment distributed along nearly a quarter-mile of shoreline. Authorities emphasized that Emma's decision to leave her bear spray inaccessible and to leave food unattended even briefly had created the dangerous situation. They noted that grizzlies possessed extraordinary senses of smell and would investigate any potential food source, particularly during late summer when bears fed intensively to prepare for winter hibernation. The case reinforced critical lessons about maintaining constant vigilance in bear country and never assuming that brief stops in seemingly safe locations carried no risk. The remote Arctic islands scattered across the northern reaches of Norway's Svalbard archipelago represented some of the most extreme and inhospitable environments inhabited by humans anywhere on Earth. The islands served as critical research stations for scientists studying climate change, wildlife populations, and atmospheric conditions in one of the planet's most rapidly transforming ecosystems. In November 2022, one such research outpost became the site of a harrowing encounter that illustrated the deadly efficiency of Earth's largest terrestrial predator. Mia Anders, a 31-year-old wildlife researcher from Sweden, had arrived at the isolated research station 6 weeks earlier as part of a 3-month assignment studying Arctic fox populations and their adaptation to changing sea ice conditions. The station, operated by an international consortium of universities, housed approximately 8 researchers during the winter months. However, several had departed on scheduled supply flights, leaving only 4 people present in mid-November. The facility consisted of several prefabricated buildings clustered together for warmth and safety, surrounded by vast expanses of sea ice, exposed tundra, and rocky outcroppings that offered minimal shelter from brutal Arctic winds. Mia had established several camera stations at various locations around the research area, positioned to capture images of foxes, seals, and occasionally polar bears that wandered through the territory. Station protocols required researchers to carry firearms when venturing outside, maintain constant radio contact, and work in pairs whenever possible. However, equipment malfunctions and the pressure to collect data before the polar night made solo work dangerously common, despite official policies prohibiting such practices. The evening of November 12th brought clear skies and relatively calm winds. Though darkness had been absolute for weeks already, the sun would not rise above the horizon again until late January, creating a perpetual twilight that disoriented newcomers and challenged even experienced Arctic researchers. Mia left the main station building around 8 o'clock in the evening, bundled in multiple layers of insulated clothing, to adjust several cameras that had been transmitting intermittent signals suggesting technical problems. She carried a headlamp, radio, emergency flare, and a rifle, following protocols despite the short distance involved. Her food cache and personal tent stood approximately 100 yards from the main building, positioned near one of the camera locations she planned to service. The temperature hovered around -25 degrees Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Mia's breath formed clouds of ice crystals that caught in her headlamp beam as she trudged across the frozen ground. She reached the first camera station and began making adjustments, working methodically despite thick gloves that made fine motor control difficult. The camera had suffered a loose connection in its solar panel array, a common problem in extreme cold where materials contracted and expanded unpredictably. What Mia failed to notice was the massive polar bear that had been tracking her scent for the past 20 minutes. Polar bears, unlike their brown and black cousins, were true apex predators that actively hunted humans when opportunity presented itself. The animal, a mature male weighing approximately 1,200 pounds, had approached from downwind, moving with the silent efficiency that made the species so deadly. The bear's white fur provided perfect camouflage against snow and ice, and the darkness rendered visual detection nearly impossible beyond the narrow cone of Mia's headlamp. The bear circled Mia's position at a distance of roughly 50 yards, stopping occasionally to test the air and assess the situation. It showed particular interest in the food cache near Mia's tent, which contained dried fish, freeze-dried meals, and various other supplies that produced scents detectable from considerable distances. Polar bears possess the most acute sense of smell among all bear species, capable of detecting seals breathing beneath several feet of ice or carrion from miles away. Mia finished adjusting the camera and began walking toward her tent to check the food cache, which she had been instructed to inventory as part of routine station management. She had covered approximately 30 feet when she noticed tracks in the snow illuminated by her headlamp. The massive paw prints, each larger than a dinner plate, appeared fresh and led directly toward her tent. Her stomach tightened with fear as she realized a polar bear had been in the immediate area recently, possibly within minutes. She spun around, sweeping her headlamp in wide arcs to scan the surrounding darkness. The beam caught 2 reflective green eyes approximately 40 yards away. The polar bear stood motionless, watching her with the patient calculation of an experienced predator. Mia's hands trembled as she unslung her rifle, fumbling with the safety mechanism through her thick gloves. Before she could properly shoulder the weapon, the bear began advancing, not charging but moving deliberately closer with clear intent. Mia backed away slowly, speaking in a loud, steady voice as she had been trained. She avoided direct eye contact while keeping the bear visible in her peripheral vision. The animal continued approaching, closing the distance to roughly 25 yards. Mia's back foot caught on a chunk of ice, causing her to stumble. The bear immediately lunged forward, interpreting the movement as weakness or an invitation to attack. The animal closed the remaining distance with explosive speed. Mia managed to fire one shot from her rifle, but the bullet went high in her panic, disappearing harmlessly into the darkness. The polar bear rose on its hind legs, towering over 9 feet tall, and swung one massive paw downward. The blow connected with Mia's shoulder and upper chest, the force spinning her around and knocking her face first into the snow. Her rifle flew from her grasp, landing several feet away and effectively useless. Mia rolled instinctively toward a pressure ridge, an uplifted section of sea ice that created a natural barrier roughly 3 feet high. She wedged herself into the narrow space between ice blocks, making her body as small as possible. The bear dropped to all fours and approached the ridge, sniffing loudly and pawing at the ice near Mia's position. It could easily see her and certainly smelled her fear, but the confined space prevented the animal from reaching her effectively. For several agonizing minutes, the bear circled the pressure ridge, occasionally rising to peer over the ice and investigate this strange prey that had suddenly become inaccessible. Mia remained absolutely still, fighting the urge to scream or move, speaking in low, calm tones that she hoped would either bore or confuse the predator. Her shoulder throbbed with pain where the bear's claws had torn through multiple layers of clothing and opened deep gashes in the muscle beneath. The standoff continued for what Mia estimated as 15 to 20 minutes, though tracking time accurately while experiencing such terror proved impossible. The bear eventually lost interest, or perhaps heard something that attracted its attention elsewhere. It dropped to all fours, cast a final glance toward the pressure ridge, then padded silently away across the ice, disappearing into the absolute darkness beyond Mia's limited field of vision. Mia waited another 10 minutes before daring to move. She retrieved her rifle with shaking hands and half ran, half stumbled back toward the research station, triggering her emergency flare to alert others of her distress. 2 colleagues met her halfway, both armed and using powerful searchlights to scan for threats. They escorted her inside, where the station's medical officer treated her injuries, which included 4 deep lacerations across her shoulder, severe bruising along her ribs and back, and early-stage hypothermia from lying on the ice. A supply flight evacuated Mia to mainland Norway 3 days later for additional medical treatment. Her wounds required extensive surgical repair and months of physical therapy, leaving permanent scars but no lasting disability. Wildlife authorities emphasized that polar bears were considered the most dangerous bear species because they viewed humans as legitimate prey rather than threats to avoid. They noted that Mia's survival resulted primarily from her ability to find shelter in the pressure ridge, as polar bears rarely abandoned attacks unless physically prevented from reaching their target. The incident reinforced the critical importance of maintaining strict safety protocols in polar bear territory and never underestimating the species' predatory capabilities.